there's this litigation that we're dealing with in the world of MLS. And it's important to note that NAR, the National Association of Realtors, doesn't have an MLS. So it does not, there is no national MLS, but what you've got is you've got pretty much local MLSs or regional MLSs, multiple listing services, but they follow the guidelines set forth by the National Association of Realtors, because what NAR has done for us and done for MLS is they create this great marketplace for real estate is by creating guidelines, which are pretty much like best practices. If your MLS follows those, then they get the insurance coverage offered by the National Association of Realtors. So it makes sense for local MLSs to follow the rules of NAR. So what recently, in the last couple of years, there are 3 major lawsuits and then a big one against NAR by the Department of Justice. And those 3 are Moehrl in Illinois against 25 of the biggest MLSs in the country and all of the big real estate firms that you can think of and name. And then there's a smaller one in New England, actually, MLS PIN. That's the Multiple Listing Service Property Information Network, kind of the Boston area, New England area. And that's a separate case. And then there's a third case in Missouri, and that's Sitzer Burnett. And the big news in the industry is that the Sitzer Burnett case, the jury ruled in 2 hours and 24 minutes against, actually held the plaintiffs liable. And who are the plaintiffs? They're like Remax, Keller Williams, Anywhere, which is Century 21, Coldwell Banker, ERA, right? A number of franchises. And what is it? Home Services of America. These brokerage firms, these franchises really, and the National Association of Realtors, and found that they were liable for violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act for the transactions, class action. Sellers were the plaintiffs, and to go back 5 years and recover damages, and to the amount of something like 1.75 billion. And because it's antitrust, it's treble damages. So $5 billion charge against organized real estate. And of course, NAR is going to appeal it. We'll see where that goes. But in the meantime, that creates some issues. And what you have to know historically is that the target is not the amount of commission. While people might say that, the fact is you could enter $1 into the MLS for years, and you could actually enter 0 in, because that offer of compensation, and NAR recognizes the offer of compensation is just an offer, and it could be 0. But the structure is that the MLS has been since 1996 a unilateral offer of compensation. And what the plaintiffs are saying is just that offer of compensation skews commissions, because buyers don't negotiate, sellers think they have to offer commission, and so that skews it. And so that's the big issue. And all of these cases are around the offer of compensation. That's what the DOJ would like to eliminate. Nobody wants to admit that. That's what they want to eliminate. It goes back many, many years. And the offer of compensation has only been around since 1996. That's what a lot of people don't know. So this thing that everybody is saying is the enemy, the offer of compensation, which is inflating commissions. The fact is it's only been around since 1996. Prior to 1996, the compensation vehicle for MLS was an offer of subagency. So prior to 1996, the MLS was not an offer of compensation, it was an offer of subagency. And so if you belong to the MLS, what you say is, I belong to the MLS, I take a listing, I get an agreement from the seller, I put my listing in the MLS, and any of you that want to sell my listing, you'll represent my seller the way I represent my seller. And then, of course, you're entitled to part of the commission because I represent the seller and you represent the seller. And so that was the compensation vehicle of the MLS. It was an offer of compensation. And what that meant, though, was buyers had no representation. And they didn't. And agents knew that. Everybody knew. You say, who do you represent in a real estate transaction? And you might remember this, Dan. You say, well, I represent the seller. And then you ask people, why do you represent the seller? Well, they didn't often know, but the reason they represented the seller was they belonged to the MLS, and the MLS was a unilateral offer of subagency. And then in 1988, California passed the first agency disclosure law. And so now we had a situation where we had to disclose to buyers who we represented in a transaction. So a lot of times agents don't learn about the forms that they have to present to people. And that was the way it was in California. And in California, the way you can represent people in real estate transactions, you can represent the seller exclusively, you can represent the buyer exclusively, or you can represent the seller and the buyer as a dual agent. And so you had to make this disclosure. You had to say, here's the way it works in California. I can represent the buyer, I can represent the seller, I can represent both. And since I don't have the listing, agents thought, well, since I don't have the listing, I guess I represent the buyer. And so they would check the box that said they represented the buyer exclusively. Well, the fact is, when they checked that box and they signed that disclosure agreement, they were really documenting an undisclosed dual agency because they didn't represent the buyer exclusively. By virtue of them belonging to the MLS, they represented the seller. Now they told the seller they represented them, and they told the buyer they represented them, and that's a divided agency. So the MLS had to change when agency disclosure came along. And the change was we moved the compensation vehicle from an offer of subagency to an offer of compensation. And NAR adopted that around 1996. So it's been good for years. Nobody's complained about that side of it. And it's only recently, and it's been a hot market, right? A lot of reasons why it's come up now. And so now we've got people fighting what was put into place as an evolutionary change to MLS, which was there for the benefit of consumers.
Right.
Right. So we brought this thing in. It was to benefit consumers, and everybody thought that was a great idea. Now everybody's protected. Now it's being disclosed, and now that's being attacked. Right. And it's being successfully attacked. And I believe what will happen is I think that you'll probably see the offer of compensation disappear from MLSs. I don't care what anybody says, but that doesn't mean the MLS isn't valuable. That doesn't mean that it doesn't offer a service. We have to change our conversation a little bit, but cooperating with other people, that makes a lot of sense. Creating a platform for that to take place, that makes a lot of sense. Being able to market properties, there are going to be some other fundamental changes to MLSs. So MLS is not dead. Was it Mark Twain that said the rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated?
Yeah, right.
So MLS is not dead. MLS is continuing to evolve the way it evolved in 1996 and prior to that. But it's big news in the industry because people think, well, now buyers aren't going to get represented. No, we'll figure out a way that takes place. Didn't you mention, Dan, in the commercial world, or Andre, that's the way it works in the commercial world. People figure out
right
how they get the representation that they need. People get paid. We're going to figure all this out. But what it creates is opportunity for the first people to figure it out.